Hey BritMonkey, Michael here. Have you ever had a refreshing drink of tea? I take mine black. Mirror is a horror anthology series. In 2018, their episode Bandersnatch was a postmodernist interactive film dealing with themes of free will and decision making. In one scene, the film's viewer is able to make a choice: destroy a cup of tea or don't. Data released by Netflix showed that people who live in countries where tea drinking is more common, such as Turkey, the United Kingdom, or Ireland, viewers selected this option less often than viewers in countries where tea is not as popular. It would seem that whether we destroy a cup of tea in a video game is determined by where we grow up. Our entire orderly society is based around the idea that we are free to make our own choices, be punished when they are morally wrong, and take praise when they are good. But what if we couldn't make that choice at all? What if everything we do is just a chemical response to the world around us? What if free will does not exist? Philosophers have debated this topic for millennia, and there are countless branches and theories, but ultimately the determinist argument, the idea that you don't have free will, boils down to this. Everything in the universe conforms to the natural laws of the universe. Everything has a cause that produces the same outcome every time. You put a spoon in the microwave and it blows up 100% of the time. You mix Mentos and Coke and it blows up. Guaranteed. Why should the human brain be any different? You input sensory information, it undergoes a chemical process that we don't quite understand, and decisions come out the other end. Every action you take, from picking up a book to deciding what college to go to, is the result of neurons firing. Neurons fire in a way determined by the laws of chemistry and physics, which acts the same way every time. You can't decide if or when a neuron fires. Think of a game of chess. There are trillions of ways to play a single game of chess, but if you cut it down to just a few pieces, the number of possible outcomes becomes severely limited. This version you see on screen only has 7 possible outcomes based on the input of the players. The human brain is just a giant version of a chessboard. External inputs go in, results come out. So you don't have free will. All of your decisions are just complex chemical brain responses to external stimuli, right? But for philosophers on the opposing side of the debate, this middle bit is the point of contention. We don't know how the brain works. Who knows what could be going on at this stage? Humans are pretty unique as far as animals go. We can be creative and artistic, we can imagine abstract concepts and 4-dimensional objects. Why would evolution give us consciousness if that consciousness didn't play a role? Maybe this decision-making mind is separate from the brain, using the brain as some sort of looking glass into the real world. This would make your consciousness exempt from the natural laws of physics, and thus able to independently make decisions. There are entire fields of study based on the idea that the universe doesn't always conform to the laws of physics as we know them. This position is called libertarian free will, which has nothing to do with Ron Paul and taxes. It just means you are completely free to make your own decisions. There's also a mystery third position that we'll get to later, but we have to move on. We can argue about philosophy all day, as hundreds of philosophers did for millennia, before we discovered neuroscience. Can we answer the question of free will with neuroscience? Most proponents of determinism will point to the work of neuroscientist Benjamin Libet in 1983. Libet asked volunteers, wait, if free will isn't real, then technically they weren't volunteers. Whatever, Libet asked participants hooked up to a brain scanning machine to stare at a ticking clock and flick their wrist whenever they felt like it. Before they flicked their wrist, Libet instructed them to make a mental note of what the time the clock said when they decided to make the action. The results were kinda spooky. The participants' brains began the process of contracting the muscles to flick the wrist roughly half a second before the participants said they decided to. The time on the clock they claimed they made the decision was after the time their body began to execute the action. This would imply that something else in the participant's brain decided to flick the wrist, and the consciousness merely thinks that it made a choice, when in reality it was just doing what the body told it to do. The human brain is really good at using past experiences to infer new information. Could it be that every decision you think you've made is just coming up with excuses? This was pioneering stuff that laid the groundwork for nearly all future studies on free will, but of course was not without criticism. For starters, asking the participants to remember when they decided to start the action immediately casts doubt on the accuracy of these brain scans. Making a mental note of the clock's time happens after you decided to flick your wrist. Of course it would appear like your brain began the process before you decided it. And being told to flick your wrist is a lot different to, say, deciding to commit arson. There's a difference between decisions, urges, intentions, and plans. Libet seemed to assume that what he measured should be interpreted as a decision, rather than a more probable urge. In a similar experiment, Libet attempted to solve these flaws by adding a new variable. Subjects were told to push a button when they felt like it, but if they heard a buzzer during the movement, they had to stop moving. The results were the same. The subjects' bodies began moving to push the button before the subject said they decided to. But when they heard the buzzer and stopped the action, there was no recorded brain activity to tell the body to stop doing the action. It simply stopped. Very curious. Where did this command come from? This could be an indication of a veto system, or as Libet put it, free won't. Your body knows you are going to flick your wrist at some point, and so prepares to make the action before you decide to or not. If you decide against flicking your wrist, the brain activity subsides. This veto comes with its own conditions, like the point of no return. If you decide against pushing the button too late, you cannot stop it. And if you try to remember hard enough, you know you've done this before. Okay, the determinists have had their pitch. What kind of science do the libertarians have to support their arguments? Uranium-238. This goes somewhere, I promise. Pure uranium-238, where every particle is exactly the same, acts unpredictably. A lump of the stuff in a pure vacuum will begin to decay and shed off alpha particles at complete random. Yes, truly random. You can't predict exactly how much or how quickly uranium will decay. And nothing is causing it to do that. No external force is making uranium-238 shed off particles. This is not to say uranium is sentient and decides how often it ejects particles, but it does suggest that there is an element, no pun intended, of randomness and chance in the universe. Not just at the atomic level either. In the planetary scale, once 3 or more orbital bodies begin to interact with each other, the system is no longer predictable. No matter how many simulations you run, you cannot predict exactly how these 3 colliding objects will react. So not everything can be determined like Mentos and Coke, potentially including the human consciousness and decision-making process. But it isn't very comforting to think that our choices are random and these decisions are still not freely decided by you. Some libertarians point to the existence of an unseen, undetectable magic substance that doesn't exist in our dimension, which can override the laws of physics and make all of our choices free. But in my opinion, this is a flimsy piece of evidence. What's more likely? Could it be that your brain is a super cool, super special quantum science computer that contains a consciousness bending in and out of reality to a cool, metaphysical realm where you can make choices unimpeded by the real world? I guess so, but what's more likely? That, or your brain is just a weird piece of electrical meat? I think it's the second one. Back to experiments. Scientists in Paris, led by Aaron Scherger, attempted a repeat of Libet's experiments, but with one key difference. Some of the participants would be told to not move at all. Scherger hypothesized that Libet had been cherry-picking data, and the slow increase in brain activity before the conscious decision to move was just background noise that they had misinterpreted as the body gearing up to move. They used a computer to pinpoint the moment where the brain activity of the moving group diverged from the brain activity of the non-moving group. Lo and behold, the point where the activity was clearly not background noise coincided with the point of conscious decision. To put more clearly, the point people say they decided to move was at the same time they actually began to move. Later still, scientists in California found that decisions based on abstract concepts, for example asking participants to choose which charity to donate $1,000 to, did not produce the same results as Libet's experiments. There was no build-up of activity, the decisions were simply made. Okay, sure, maybe that casts doubt on Libet's experiments, but disproving determinism doesn't demonstrate indeterminable decisions. What is the strongest possible neuroscientific evidence for the existence of free will? Wilder Penfield was an American-Canadian neurosurgeon. In his memoir, Mystery of the Mind, Penfield speaks of the thousands of brain operations he undertook on conscious patients in his career. By stimulating different parts of the exposed brain, he could make the patients do things, like move their limbs, taste sourness, evoke memories, or make them feel a certain emotion, things that we know the brain is responsible for. But in not a single one of these operations, no matter what parts of the brain he stimulated, he could never change a patient's will. He couldn't make them think 2 + 2 is 5, change their moral beliefs, or make them want to learn to play the violin. Couldn't do it. He also noticed that nobody ever had seizures that change how people think. Seizures are electrical storms in the brain that cause all sorts of devastating physical actions, but never anything in the mind. If all of our thoughts, choices, and actions are caused entirely by brain chemistry, why don't people occasionally have seizures that trigger involuntary will? Why don't we have morality seizures? Seizures that make you want to become a Mormon? You might change your beliefs as a consequence of a seizure. For example, many people become religious after near-death experiences. But not in the mountains of scientific evidence. In the billions of seizures throughout human history, has a single instance been recorded of a seizure directly changing a person's conscious will. Is this not proof that the mind is separate from our physical brain and body, capable of making decisions unimpeded by external stimuli? Maybe. Penfield didn't make any solid conclusions from his work, though he did say it is unlikely that consciousness and the brain are the same thing. But recent research casts doubt on this too. French scientists in 2009 were able to manipulate part of the brain and give patients the strong desire to move their arms, with some patients even feeling like they had moved their body. Wait, but even then patients were able to tell what desires were stimulated by researchers and what desires had arisen naturally. Surely that is proof that you can't truly manipulate willpower. Yes, but that could show consciousness is merely neurological background noise and is just an accidental occurrence that serves no functional purpose within the body. We can go back and forth about this all day, so let's move on to the mystery third position from earlier. Compatibilism. Compatibilism is best described by philosopher John Locke in his voluntary prisoner thought experiment. Suppose there is a criminal who wants to be in prison. He doesn't check the door to his cell, so it could be locked or unlocked. Is he truly a prisoner, or is he a free man? Put more simply, if your action is not coerced by external factors, then you do have free will, even if it is predetermined by brain chemistry. Compatibilists argue that whether you are controlled by a soul-like consciousness or if you are just a biological puppet, the result is the same. You are still you. And unless that puppet is being controlled by something else, say you're being brainwashed or hypnotized or whatever, then it's basically the same as having libertarian free will. It's tough to get your head around, and it's basically a coward's way out of calling yourself a determinist. But this model is supported by a majority of philosophers, nearly 60% in fact. Not that I put any weight on their opinions. Neuroscientists too are increasingly moving towards this position, but only to avoid unproductive arguments with philosophers. Instead of free will, scientists are now calling it conscious volition. Did you A. do the thing without being forced to by external factors, and B. are you aware that you did the thing? If yes to both, you do have free will. The final experiment I want to talk about was conducted in 1990 by researchers in Australia. Right-handed individuals were asked to make a conscious choice to raise one of their hands when they felt like it. Naturally, being right-handed, they were prone to lifting their right hand, doing so 60% of the time. But when the brain was subject to transcranial magnetic stimulation without their knowledge, this changed. They instead lifted their left hand 80% of the time. Despite being touted as proof against free will, I think this is actually proof of its existence. Note that despite being influenced to lift their hand more often, it was still not 100%. While you can make a decent prediction of what someone is going to do, you can never be certain. Think back to the philosophical views from earlier. You put a spoon under the microwave and it blows up 100% of the time. You put a human brain under a microwave and it doesn't always react the same. A rock sliding down a mountain or a domino tipping over has no say in the matter and cannot stop it. But human beings can deliberate on their choices. They can pause to think before acting, and they can weigh the pros and cons of each decision. Maybe the human body is like a ship. The crew, or your conscious thoughts, can steer the ship the best they can using all the sensory inputs they have. But the condition of the ship and the sway of the ocean also affects the captain's decision and how easy it is to navigate the waters. Still, as we've discussed, the seeds of doubt are still everywhere for both sides of the argument, and no matter how compelling you might find one piece of evidence, evidence to the contrary is still there. This sort of thing used to keep me up at night, and I was terrified of the possibility that my entire life is just watching something else pilot my body, and I'm just along for the ride. I think we'd all like to believe that the people we love, our life goals, or even what we had for breakfast this morning wasn't decided for us at the start of the universe. But then I read about philosopher William James. He was extremely depressed for months on end because he wasn't sure free will existed. Until one day, on the 30th of April 1870, he instantly cured this depression by writing in his diary, "I will assume for the present that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." And as always, thanks for watching.